Showtime. Welcome to the show. I'm Brent Holland. Get in your most comfy chair, folks. Tonight's the night to relax. Take some time for yourself. Get the coffee going, tea going, or a beverage of choice. We're going to be looking at Larry Hancock's new book called The Oswald Puzzle, Reconsidering Lee Harvey Oswald. In the last show, folks, we talked about the Warren Commission, how they set him up, how they had this perfect patsy, if you will, to put into this slot that would allow them to come out and not really do any honest research. Larry Hancock, of course, has been on this show. My goodness, I think he might be the most popular person on this show. Larry, I think you've been on the most times. Larry Hancock brings his formal training in history and cultural anthropology to his research and writing on Cold War history and national security subjects. Larry is a board member of the Mary Farrell Foundation, a major online interactive history archive, with a dozen books in print. His works include Shadow Warfare, In Denial, Surprise Attack, Someone Would Have Talked. It's the Bible, one of the Bibles, folks, for the JFK conspiracy. Killing King, Tipping Point, The Conspiracy That Murdered President Kennedy. The book tonight is called, it's his new one, The Oswald Puzzle, Reconsidering Lee Harvey Oswald. Larry, welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you, always.
Just seems to be like a few minutes ago we spoke. And it was, folks. You know, I'm staggering these shows. Okay, let's talk about the anti-Castro Cubans and the DRE, D-R-E. What impressed me about your book, Larry, is very few researchers mention the Cuban Missile Crisis and the influence it had on the Warren Commission's report. You're the exception, and a hearty bravo to you. The Cuban Missile Crisis had taken place a little over a year, folks, just before when we were that close to annihilation and Armageddon for the world. Can you speak to that and the need to control the narrative in the upper echelons of government? It also impacted the anti-Castro Cubans, and that's what I want to talk about as well. And how hateful were they of JFK for his about face on Cuba?
And we're talking, the group we're talking about, of course, by this time, even by the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were thousands and thousands of Cuban expatriates had been say, in New Orleans, in New York, in Florida for years. I mean, they'd even been there during the Batista regime, and there were some large corporate businesses, New York City. A lot of the children of the higher economic levels within Cuba under the Batista regime had studied in the U.S. A lot of them in colleges in the New Orleans area. New Orleans is probably more of a hotbed of Cuban expats and anti-Castro activity than most would assume. Certainly, when I get a lot of people during the Garrison investigation often went, what in the world did Garrison and New Orleans have to do with Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas? I can remember saying that to myself when I heard the news stories. Like, what? It happened in Dallas. Why would anybody be talking about New Orleans? Anyway, there was a Cuban community, large Cuban communities in several cities that had fled from Batista or that had been economically related to the Batista regime and profited from it. So big Cuban communities, Chicago, New York, Miami, Dallas. But in particular, we're talking about a community that was pro-revolutionary Cuba. They had been there. They had been behind Castro to overthrow Batista. Castro took over, and then Castro essentially went way beyond socialist to becoming communist and allied to the Soviet Union. So we've got a whole segment of people that had been with Castro. I mean, closely part of his military groups. Some of it has served as bodyguards to major Cuban leaders in the revolution, like Manuel Artime. When these people all essentially defect from Castro's new ideology and his socialist revolution and reject it, they're in the U.S. They either they either came out after the revolution. In any event, the Cuban community in the U.S. is now largely anti-Castro, right?
They all
So
fled.
and supported the landings at the Bay of Pigs, which JFK inherited, which were nothing that he had started. They were totally different from what the Cuban project had been in the first place. But they were all involved in it. And many of these people were part of the Cuban Brigade. They landed in Cuba. They were put in prisons. And they were only being released some 2 years later. So we've got a groups of hundreds and thousands of people who are fervently anti-Castro, personally committed. Their friends have died. They've been tortured. They've been in prison. And then the Cuban Missile Crisis happens in 1962. Okay. They assume that the United States is going to attack Cuba. How could you not assume that if you're Cuban? The Russians have come in, Castro's allied with them, Castro's threatened to send missiles against the U.S. And when Kennedy diffused the situation and essentially overtly reached an agreement that the United States would not overtly participate in any military action against Cuba, it was the second strike. One had been the Bay of Pigs, which they felt, because we now know, because their senior CI officers literally lied to the Cubans about
And to
JFK's
Kennedy
decision.
himself, too.
Yeah, it's really one of the saddest parts of our history that they blamed JFK totally falsely.
Yep.
But they assumed they had felt bad about him then, that he'd been betrayed. Now with the Cuban Missile Crisis, he's betrayed him twice.
Twice.
Okay, two strikes. And in 1963, JFK, unknown to most of the Cubans, doesn't abandon the Cubans, but for political reasons decides he's going to have to take all military operations against Cuba offshore, out of the United States. So he starts a new program very covertly, but it's a very complex program. Like, how do you attack Cuba from out of the United States and support it with these Cubans and nobody notices? It's like, well, okay. You might assume
Good
that
luck
this is
with
not
that.
going to work. It was a reach, but he's in a bind. But while that's going on, and while that starts to go on, Fidel Castro reaches out to him, to JFK personally, through personal representatives, and said, "Oh, by the way, President Kennedy, I'm tired of the Russians. They betrayed
Mm.
us. They deserted us. I'd like to kick them out. So how about if we kick them out, we go neutral, we stop exporting our revolution, we can do a deal. You can lift the economic embargoes, we can be neutral, like Laos is, like, okay." And that process starts. So that's going to be the third strike. So it's the Cuban Missile Crisis, part of a three-stage evolution to infuriate the anti-Castro community and let the people that are told about, and the people are told about this secret negotiation because it leaks down from the CIA in Washington, D.C. to Miami. These are people that are literally know that if JFK proceeds, they're done. They're never going home. Castro's going to stay. Give it up. We're done. Everybody that has lost friends and relatives and sacrificed for the last 4 years, it's over. And that's so the missile crisis by itself, we'll all look at very positively, right? Not these people. They look at it as being abandoned by President Kennedy. And
Completely.
worse yet, they now know in 1963, but by the summer of 1963, word is coming down from Washington that these people are no longer allowed to engage in military activities. There will be no more Cuban anti-Castro missions. And
Funding is
by the way,
pulled.
if you're involved in this, you're not even allowed to leave the Miami area. You can't travel because you guys, we know what you want to do, but you can't even travel within the U.S. And that's where things are when Oswald shows up and engages the Cuban community in New Orleans.
Perfect storm. And I want to validate what you said before, too, about Castro reaching out to Kennedy and vice versa. As you all know, folks, I made a documentary on Ted Sorensen, and Ted had told me, JFK speechwriter and aide, that indeed that was true, that they were hoping for some kind of agreement, something like Tito had with the Soviet Union, where they could be communists but not aligned. And the key word is aligned here with the Soviet Union. In other words, you could have your own government. Kennedy didn't want to influence the government of Cuba like that, but he just didn't want them to be a puppet state of the Soviet Union. So that's absolutely true, Larry. And that must have really, really sent off some incredible emotions in the anti-Castro Cuban. And let's pick it up. So into this mix arrives Lee Harvey Oswald.
And Lee Harvey Oswald is, and again, you have to look at his full story. I know there are many views, and we dealt with many views, but if you go all back, the way back to his teen years, Lee Harvey Oswald, when he's still in Dallas, before he goes into the Marines, is writing letters to the Young Socialist Federation, declaring himself. He's been studying Marxism. He believes in economic justice. He believes in, basically he wants to join this movement. This is what he believes, and what he will repeatedly say he believes in for until his death. And I think one of the things we face is there are a lot of people who just don't accept that. It's like the fact that he would be writing letters and saying things for like 5, 6 years that are totally false. But but this is the historical record. You can't really fight that. And actually, when he writes The Young Socialist, he says, well, and he writes in some detail about his views and what he believes, and says, I want to join your organization. And by the way, are there any groups around here that I can join? Clearly not an antisocial guy, right? I want to join a group. And by the way, if I can't join a group, could I start a group?
I start a group.
Okay. Again, not your typical antisocial guy.
Your typical scout group. Yeah.
So, but from then on, if you look at his reading materials, if you look at especially his speaking, what he says, even when he goes to write, yes, he is a socialist. He is a Marxist. I think it's fair to say his view of Marxism essentially is socialism, and he uses the words almost interchangeably. And he writes about what that means. And I think that's an important thing, because otherwise you'd be guessing what it really means to him. But by 1963, he's writing a series of monographs about, he went to the Soviet Union, saw what life was like there, and how they had implemented socialism, communism, Marxism, and rejected it. Because all they had really done was build their own bureaucracy, and they were still nationalist. And it wasn't really, it was as structured economically. It just has new names for it. And he writes about that very negatively. And then he writes about what he thinks should be, and which is a combination of capitalism and Marxist socialism, combining both. And, he's very specific. Yes, this should be under government control. This should not be under government control. Everyone should have free education, free medical treatment. So you can see where he is.
I think you just described Canada there for a second.
Yeah. But then he turned around and went the wrong direction, Brent. Rather than looking north, he looked south. What can I say?
Just a little joke. We're having some fun tonight, folks.
But Lee Harvey Oswald was not passive. That's another thing. What he believed very firmly, and he wanted to be part of it. He had wanted to go to Russia to see if he could be part of something that he could relate to, and he found out, no, they're not doing it right. Well, back in the U.S. during the latter part of 62 and 63, all of the literature he's reading, and we have copies of it. I mean, Oswald turned out to be a pack rat, and which is hardly ever mentioned. He has copies, subscribed to and has copies of the Socialist Workers' Party magazine. We know what he's reading. So again, everything he's reading, the stuff he's checking out from the library, stuff that he's checking out from the library and not returning and keeping, okay? Didn't say he was, totally honest. Um, all tells the same story. So if you choose to disbelieve that, you literally have to throw out all the historical information we have and say it's all a front. It's not what he was. But so he's writing about what he believes, but also he wants to join in, even in the Marines.
Hmm.
We have records of him talking to like a, a bunkmate, Delgado, in the same barracks about, you know, can you help me learn a little Spanish? It looks like the Cuban Revolution is right doing the right thing. Let's get out of the Marines. Let's go to Cuba and join in the revolution, join into Central America, push back against Yankee imperialism. You know,
Do you
that's
think he's an
consistent.
idealist, Larry?
Definitely an idealist.
In the
And
same sense that, boy, I'm going to get a lot of help for this, that perhaps Kennedy was an idealist?
an idealist and more of an activist, maybe even than Jay. Of course, he would have to be more of an. Kennedy was an activist in a sphere that he can influence, right? He
Hmm.
has
Hmm.
the money, the power, the connections, so he could pursue his beliefs. Lee Harvey Oswald wants to pursue many of the same beliefs, especially on racism. He is
Mm,
avidly opposed to racism. He
big
is
time.
avidly opposed to, he believes in capitalism, in certain aspects of capitalism, and doesn't want to do away with capitalism. But, so yeah, I think his beliefs are much aligned with Kennedy. He's, but one of the differences is, and I think this is a difference, again, those of us in the conspiracy front have tended to reject some of the sources a historian would normally go to because
Mm,
we didn't like what they were saying. It's like, okay, we're not going to listen to his wife because we don't trust his wife. We're not going to listen to his best friend because we don't trust his best friend because they didn't say exactly what we wanted to hear all the time. Okay. That's bad for history. Historians can't do that.
agreed.
Eh,
Completely.
so George de Mohrenschildt is on record of saying in the spring of 1963, while he's writing and talking about his idealism, he said two things. He said, well, first of all, to George, when George was going, you're probably too idealistic, Lee. You're a lot more idealistic than my son is, and most of the people I know. Uh, and this is all never going to happen. You realize that. And Oswald comes back to George and says, yeah, I know that. I know it's probably not going to happen, but it's what I believe and it's what I should be pursuing. And George then says, well, if you're going to pursue it, you've got to do more than just write about it. You got to get out there and do something. And that's where he moves to a new level of activism. Like he's going to oppose fascist, racist. He's going to, he wants to go to Cuba. Marina
Hmm.
Oswald said at that point in time, his whole goal was to get back to Cuba. And he starts, by the way, in January of that year, which again, we tend to ignore, trying to get Marina back to Russia. And over the full year of 1963, Marina herself is writing letters to the Soviet Union. She's still a citizen. I still want to come back. And one of the things that always puzzles me is, again, all of us and I've written this. So, okay,
Hmm.
disclaimer, recanting. I would say, oh, no, they made her say what they wanted to say because they threatened to send her back to Russia. It's kind of like, do you guys realize that she has written 7 different letters and has an application in to return to Russia? No, they weren't threatening her with sending her back to Russia. She probably would again, yes, okay, go now, send me plane to Moscow. But the point being, Oswald did change from being just a reader, a
Hmm.
writer, and really committed himself, as he said, to trying to get to Cuba. And but of course, to get to Cuba, one of the things he's got to do is it wasn't illegal for him to travel to Russia. That was perfectly legal. He did, even speaking out against the U.S., he never completed paperwork to renounce the citizenship. He never, everything, and he ended up in a factory in Russia. Now,
That's right.
Oswald
Yeah.
being a pretty bright guy, it's like he really doesn't want to go to Cuba and end up in a sugarcane field. You can be pretty he wants to be, if he's going to be a revolutionary, he wants to, have some kind of an entree to Cuba. So he wants to get to Cuba, and he starts building himself a resume in New Orleans. And the resume, actually, he takes that resume. We again ignore the fact that when he ended up in Mexico City to try to persuade the Cubans to give him an entry visa, he brought his resume with him. Paperwork of the organizations he joined, pictures of his leafleting, and the secretary at the embassy said, "Look, he brought all this stuff trying to convince us of how much a Cuban patriot he was, how much, so he
Hmm.
wanted an entree and really did that in Miami and got into the newspapers, the TV,
Hmm.
radio,
Hmm.
became a public figure, so much so that the anti-Castro Cubans, who were reporting his activities back to their headquarters in Miami, started a propaganda campaign against him in August,
Here's the
which
connection,
is
folks.
stunning.
Hmm.
You know, he was everybody at some point in time, everybody's going to complain. We never heard of Oswald. The CIA is going, oh, right, he was never, but DRE, the student organization, who is the CIA's propaganda arm,
Hmm.
is already starting propaganda using Oswald. And it would be insane to think that the people who are paying them to do propaganda, which the CIA was, would not know that. In fact, the DRE leaders told Jeff Morley that, of course, we told that to the CIA. That's what they were paying us to do. And we needed something to convince them to keep paying us.
Keep the money flowing, right? You do
Yeah.
whatever you can. It's like
Yeah.
anybody in a corporation knows that when the it comes time for your budget, if you don't spend the budget that's allotted to you, guess what? Thanks for
Well,
saving us money. I
yeah.
guess we can cut you by $1 million, right?
And we're
Um,
seeing that in the US today. It's kind of the what have you done today syndrome. And I won't go any further with that.
well,
Um,
you could run
but
around with a chainsaw if you want.
yeah.
Do you know his mother's Canadian? Just by the way, you think she would have reined him in? I'm talking about Elon Musk, folks. Oh my God. Anyways, okay, let's not go down that particular
Uh,
rabbit hole. Let's stay
but
here.
so Oswald comes to the your question early on was about Oswald and the CIA.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
it's silly to think that Oswald was not brought to the CIA's attention, that the CIA certainly had already been aware of Lee Hartzwald and opened a file on him within its counterintelligence CI-SIG group while he was in Russia. And uh, there are lots of things to be addressed in that regard because they opened the file and then did not provide the information on him to the CIA Soviet division, which they should have done unless somebody is starting to play games with the information. So, but by the time we get to the fall of 1963, as we try to detail in the book, there's every evidence that at least two CIA groups, as well as the student directorate,
Hmm.
were very well aware of Lee Oswald and had something planned for him.
Big
Uh,
time. Okay, let's leave it right there. Have you got time for another one?
yeah, mhm,
Oh, that's
sure.
great. Okay. And I promise this will be the final one. Folks, we've been speaking with Larry Hancock. His book is astounding. As always, Larry's research is, what can you say? He's Larry Hancock. The Oswald Puzzle, Reconsidering Lee Harvey Oswald. He fills in blanks. He makes this guy a three-dimensional character, a real human being, not just a cutout of a two-dimensional cutout of an assassin, a two-dimensional cutout of an unwitting spy. This is a real guy with real life problems. He's got two kids. He's got a wife. He's got to pay for them. He's trying to, and he's 22 years old. And I always felt after reading this particular book, The Oswald Puzzle, Reconsidering Lee Harvey Oswald, is that had he had the means to go to university, life would have been much, much different for him. He would have been one of those guys in the front line, um, probably against the Vietnam War, and he probably would have went on to achieve something significant in his life. But universities cost a lot of money for poor people, and that's something that I happen to agree with his idealism. I think that's something we need to change. Okay, when we come back, we're going to look at, wait till you hear this. And this is a direct quote from the book, folks, and this is why you need to get it. We're going to look at a fellow by the name of John Martino. And here's what he told his wife on the morning of November 22nd, 1963. And this is a quote. Flo, it's his wife's name. They're going to kill him. They're going to kill him when he gets to Texas. We're going to look at that when we come back. I'm Brent Holland from the Brent Holland Show. Look after each other out there. My God, if there was ever a time for that, we need it now. I'll see you next time.